So I suggest we just start maybe by taking one deep, slow breath. Just reconnect to your bodies and your minds and this present moment where we're moving after having discussed health and well-being, which is important, so don't forget to breathe. We're moving towards now thinking about that step further into humanitarian crisis. And humanitarian crisis, which are really caused by a very complex interplay of power relations, environmental degradation, climate change, and geopolitical risk. And we're going to be exploring this theme today and how nature-based solutions can provide one input into this complex subject matter. So just a quick introduction. We have we are co-chairs today. So my name is Natalie Doswald. Don't really need to say much about myself because it's here, and thank you very much to Natalie Seddon for having invited us. And I'd like to introduce my co-chair.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. That didn't work. Let's try that again. Good afternoon, everybody. Great, we got a connection there. So I'm just going to do a quick interactive kind of survey to see who's actually in the room, and we're going to make the session very interactive. So let's start with the first very easy question. For those of you who do not have gray hair, raise your hand. It shouldn't be, well, I can't do that. Okay, great. You can take down your hand. For those of you who do have gray hair, now raise your hand. Great. So please pay attention to those of you who say you don't have gray hair. Reach out and shake the hand of somebody who does have gray hair. Go ahead. Just take a minute to do that. Okay. Super. That was easy. Okay. Wow. Wow. That intergenerational connection generated a lot of excitement. I'm glad to hear that. So the second just quick question is, for those of you who you feel like you're more in the environmental sector or research, raise your hand. Okay. Those of you who are more into, let's say, climate change or climate science, raise your hand. A bit fewer. What about disaster risk reduction? A couple. How about all the above? Oh, interesting. For those of you who are confused, raise your hand. Okay. All right. So there's quite a few of you there. So with that, we'd like to get started.
So I hope you're now all awake and ready. So our session, really taking this as a holistic session, be really looking at some of the latest evidence for the values and limits of nature-based solutions and how they can support these complex crisis situations and support well-being, food, as well as adaptation to climate change. But we will also obviously see how can we collectively improve and elevate the position of nature-based solutions for climate change adaptation and development policy nationally and internationally to really support those who are the most vulnerable to climate change. I just want to frame, because we all have different paradigms, different worldviews for how we see nature-based solutions, and I think it's important in this pluralistic to understand where we're coming from. So if we are thinking of the paradigm of sustainable development, whether that's good or bad, there is an let's say, connection between the impacts of climate change, wanting to take care of the planet for the long term and meeting the needs of people through disaster risk reduction, climate change adaptation, climate mitigation, and environmental management. However, all of these processes are sadly, looked at by separate processes at the international level. As you can see, some of these, they're all very in a siloed approach, but we really want to start to think and look at as nature as a connector to all of these points. So a quick overview of the session. We have just done a hopefully 5 minutes intro. We're going to have a keynote with some Q&A, introduce the panel, have some panelist interventions, with some Q&A and a bit more interactivity with you guys, and then wrap up. And I'd get my co-chair to introduce our keynote speaker.
Great, thank you. So Dr. Elizabeth Similton has worked for over 20 years in both academia and in applied research, with positions held at C4 ECRAF and also at the Swedish International Development Cooperation. Let's please welcome, give a hand to Dr. Elizabeth Similton. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I get overexcited about talking about nature-based solutions, so I need to keep my time here, but I also have a timer somewhere down there in case I run over. I'm also very grateful to be here. I'm also very grateful to have had 2 fantastic sessions before this, who sort of set the scene and made it easier for us to start talking. So we'll see if the next slide, that's right. Okay. So with this keynote, I'm going to try to talk us through nature-based solutions and what it can do in humanitarian contexts. I'm going to give some practical examples and also propose a few of the action points, thinking about loss and damage in particular, and get this conversation going. And I have excellent panel members here who will also capture some of details that I won't be able to get into here. This map might feel very overwhelming. It has a lot of information and it's very dark, I can see. But it shows the status of global food insecurity in 79 countries as of this month. And the bottom layer that you can see that goes from yellowish to reddish, that's showing the food consumption or whether there's a shortage of food consumption. This is one of the reason I show this map. It is one of very few maps that has actually food insecurity and the main causes to food insecurity, and that monitors it regularly and brings it into the same one map. The map here also has some dots. You will see 2 of them. A purple dot that's talking about conflicts, and there are 2 other, orange and blue, that talks about lack of rainfall or too little rainfall or too much rainfall. So this map actually gives some of the causes to food insecurity. 3 of them I will cover a little bit: hazards, conflicts, and poverty. And they're of course interrelated. The first purple dots that you can see here are on conflicts. Conflicts often come over natural resources, or they lead to more fragile environments, making land inaccessible due to landmines or contamination of land and soil. WFP says that about 8 of 10 food crises are driven by conflict. And the more conflicts we have, the more people are also forced to leave their homes and come somewhere else to a different environment that they may not be used to deal with. And so these refugees have left someplace and they will arrive somewhere else. Then we have the hazards. So that would be the orange and the blue dots here. Too much and too little rainfall. These are related to extreme weather events, aggravated by climate change. And if you want to get it more complex, this is showing the different types of hazards underneath those dots that's going on at the moment for the recent 30 days or so. Some of these are related to El Niño, phases of El Niño and La Niña. These are events that can be forecasted ahead of time, which means some of the losses and damages that we see could have been avoided. Now it's getting a bit too dark for me because I can't see my... I can't see my notes, but that's okay. So with water, lack of water particularly, comes also the possibilities of pests and diseases on plants, which again has an impact on food security, of course, because we can't grow the food we need. And FAO estimates that about 5% of global agriculture GDP is lost every year due to disasters. In lower and lower middle income countries, up to 15% or more in some years, obviously, are lost. And that means some of those amounts could have been avoided, not all. The last cause to food insecurity is about poverty. Poverty means people cannot afford to buy healthy food or invest in, if they are farmers, invest in the long term in something more sustainable to grow in some cases, if it needs some years to be established before you can have the return on your farm. It could be food price inflation, something we all feel in these days. Sometimes also being in connection to being in a constant state of recovery from a previous phase of disaster, including the COVID pandemic, of course. And while the needs are increasing, the funds for humanitarian support are decreasing. The number of food insecure people have doubled since 2016. And last year, about 1.2 billion people were under some kind of food stress. That's a lot of people. So to keep those costs down, there is a tendency towards more quick fix solutions. Some would use food insecurity as an argument for large-scale investments to input-intensive industrial monoculture agriculture, grain crops particularly. So you'll be all familiar with this definition. And you and I said this morning that he's not into semantics, but I will be then. So part of why it goes wrong in my way of seeing things is that we forget the word simultaneously. Nature-based solutions are actions that benefit people and the environment simultaneously. And when we focus on trade-offs, we often forget about the synergies. Many of the losses are on the environmental side due to lack of knowledge or ignorance of ecosystem services and functions. Some we've heard already say that we can't really value ecosystems. They can't be translated into economic values. Still, we do. And we reduce our complex systems and simplify them just to fit into the monoculture models when we do the estimates. And alluding to earlier talks today, whose values are we counting and who counts? Is it the communities, the private sector, the governments, or the people who live there or who live elsewhere? In my perspective, unfortunately, I think that having 3 separate Rio conventions have contributed to this confusion and the silo thinking in practice. So instead of encouraging cross-ministry collaborations and reporting on the synergies, we keep different Excel sheets with columns for each separate crop. And this gets, as the implementation and funding also gets split between the convention, it gets split in the ministries. That's an issue too, particularly in developing countries where I think cross-ministry collaboration and sharing data is particularly important, just to report on these conventions. So referring back to the topic of the day of holistic values. This is a landscape that shows an example of how farmers sustainably manage and restore landscapes simultaneously. In my former work at C4ICRAF and FAO, we wanted to try and contain these natural ecosystems and the modified agroecosystems in the same picture. So we identified 4 types of actions. Those are sustainable practices, green infrastructure, amelioration, and conservation. And I'm going to show you a little bit what that could look like in a landscape. Sustainable production is, of course, about food production in some cases, but also feed, fiber, leaves for packaging, wood, fuel. It could be in the ways we grow to restore soil nutrients and nitrogen fixing. It could be also, as we've heard already, microclimates, so having shade trees so that people can sit and work in the shade. That also prevents soil moisture from evaporating and making soil crusts. The green infrastructure solutions are interesting because they could be instead of grey infrastructure or together with, and there are lots of examples of doing that with different root depths, or we could have wood and fiber meshes on the slopes just to stabilize the slopes. And the next one is on amelioration, which could be using crops and plants, phyto and bioremediation to, in a biological ways, remove pollutions and pollutants in the soil, water, and air. It could be push and pull systems to attract pollinators or repel insects. And it could be carbon sequestration as just one of the possibilities we can do in this landscape. And the last one is, of all the activities that humans make in a landscape, we create little mosaics of land uses. We can make them stronger by adding more biodiversity. That could be cultivated plants or wild plants. It could be the orphan crops, crops that have been forgotten, that are not used any longer, and green or blue corridors, just to connect these mosaics of landscapes. And, well, you have already maybe noticed that each of these boxes resonates with one of the conventions, the Rio Conventions. So the green one on UNCCD, the third one on UNFCCC, and the last one CBD. So we have them there, we can put them into one picture. But the farmers will not report on each of these conventions individually or separately. If we look at the pond in the corner, it has food, it stores water we can use for irrigation, or to put down a forest fire in case there is one. It reduces the speed of water and from flash floods. So it has quadruple values, a lot of values, not just one. But at the Ministries of Agriculture and in the UN statistics, if there is a loss and damage and we go out and report it, we will count the area, what crop was lost. It will not report areas where there are more than one crop, or we don't know how to contain that in the Excel sheets. It doesn't report for mixed system. It doesn't report for the losses that will be incurred on next year's production or future production. And also in the disaster reports, we cannot report what losses and damages this landscape has avoided downstream or downhill. If this landscape is purely adapted, then there would be less damage further downstream. Nobody would go here to count on those values. And the values of this landscape are simply not reported. We report by area. Field area. So for my first set of conclusions, I just wanted to go through a few more ways that we can reduce and avoid loss and damage and step out of emergency. First of all, as many have already said, we need to understand people who have lived with nature and in nature and understanding, and there's not many of them left actually. The local knowledge is deteriorating. It's becoming more of expertise and science knowledge of people who come from the outside, who haven't lived there. And FAO has raised a number of globally important agricultural heritage sites that have survived for over hundreds of years. And the one you can see here from Algeria it's showing how, by knowing the wind directions, how you can actually grow date palms and raise animals in the desert. This is a way of mimicking nature that is really clever, in my opinion. The threats, of course, to this system would be that you start pumping groundwater somewhere else, or when climate change brings a drier system as well. The second example, the one in the middle, is coming back to the beginning where I showed the number of the humanitarian context with conflicts. So this is an example where at CIFRICRAF, where we'd worked with people who have left war and moved into Uganda. And a lot of things could go wrong here. You put people in a different context. But here there has been work, and what some of the lessons learned from this is to work with people, both the refugees and the host communities at the same time. It's important here also to have agreements beforehand with land tenures and land use. One of the other important things here has been to have a driving spirit. That could be a person, an NGO or a community who has knowledge and access to knowledge about nurseries, for example, or whatever kind of knowledge you need, and who can sort of be the driver of this process. In the tree selection, it's also been important to have listen to the people. We've heard this already before. Here, women wanted to have the wood, fuel wood closer to their houses so they would feel safer to go and collect the fuel wood. Simple as that. And what's staying on my mind is all these quotes about people the refugees who have come here and say they want to leave with a less environmental footprint than when they came. This is what they have said, their own words. So the challenges here are, of course, that agroforestry systems, as have been worked with here, take time to establish if you start from scratch. If we start from zero, the trees will also have the same age. And also if there is humanitarian aid, this is a different topic, but it brings us into anticipatory action, which is something that WFP and FAO works on together, where they try to combine humanitarian aid and development aid just to reduce the gap between the two. But sometimes it might appear to the host communities that humanitarian aid is disfavoring the host community. That could be a challenge too. And of course, if there is more war and more people will be forced away, that will also have an impact on what this area can actually contain in terms of more people coming in. My last example is working with people during war. So this is Ukraine, a country that has about 3/4 of the area that's agricultural land. It's also an example, of course, of how food insecurity, of how war has had global impact on food security. Ukraine has large plains with monoculture wheat and maize and sunflower, but they also plant trees as windbreak trees to just try and reduce the soil erosion from wind. The bombing has destroyed not only farmland, but also the trees. Lots of land has been destroyed and is now unproductive due to contamination of landmines, as an example. At the same time, there's also small-scale farming, when many stories about what agriculture has meant for human health. We heard in the session before also about health and human health and what it means to touch soil with your hands. And the same stories here come from farmers who have stayed behind and have been able to grow and use land still during the war and how that felt for their health. So the reconstruction here is interesting too, that it started already while the war is still ongoing, and the private sector also interested in investing while the war is ongoing. So here I could see an opportunity for green infrastructure that would also be possibly economically cheaper as an alternative to grey infrastructure in some of the cases. So my last point here, how can we get to the step out of the emergencies and disasters and have simultaneous benefits on human and ecosystems? First of all, I think we need to be aware of what the slippery stones are. We have safe stepping stones, but there are also slippery ones. What triggers emergencies and conflict, we need to know more about those. When there is a lack in consequence thinking, especially from investors and the quick fixers. And so for the stepping stones, I just want to pull out 2 examples here of what I think needs to be done about some things. I think we need more data. This is what scientists always say. But I think the Excel sheets that can handle diverse land uses, the synergies and the multiple values, including the non-economic values, the values of local people, to estimate the avoided loss and damage as well, not only the loss and damage, and to get the right investors there. Satellite imagery and drones could be one way. That there's more research going on that now, to just know what the diversity is, so that we can have more fact-based decisions and improve early warning systems that will then reduce the disasters and emergencies. And finally, at a higher level, I think we also need to look over how we are aligning the investments to the 3 Rio Conventions that also can connect better to the SDGs. Many things, instead of splitting them up, just what would happen if we had 1 meeting instead of 3 COPs per year to go for the negotiations. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Elizabeth. So we have a round of questions. Is there anybody in the room would like to ask a question to Elizabeth?
Great points, Elizabeth. Thank you so much for sharing those practical examples. And one question I have for you, and could also even be beyond just as is to think about, what are the barriers to scale up these solutions? Because apparently it works, even within a humanitarian and war conflicts and situations. So what are really stopping us from scaling these up?
Thank you for the question. I think a very good point that I'm also struggling with. I didn't mention it, but actually I was going to say I don't think we can scale nature-based solutions. I think you can scale the how we do things. You can scale practices like the in green infrastructure. Of course, you can have terraces in many places, or you could have agroforestry systems, for example. But what you grow, you cannot scale because it depends on the local context and what farmers need or want or people want in different places. So the technology you might be able to scale, but under very careful situation and context analysis first. I really like your point earlier about also going down below subnational level to start think about what you can do there. Really, really important.
Thank you. Mike Moorcroft, Natural England. Counting avoided losses and damages, have you got any ideas how to do that? Because adaptation indicators are a traditionally very hard thing to do, and measuring something that didn't happen and also attributing why it didn't happen is hard. Do you have any insight into how we could do that better?
We've tried with the work that we did in Vietnam on a very small scale, actually, because you can really know when there are some damages and losses because of land use, man-made losses. And if it's, assuming it's raining at the same sort of level in a larger area and you have damages in some places or downstream or downhill of something, you can know where that damage is and where there isn't. Deforestation is a very obvious one where you can see the damage in the deforested area compared to the non-deforested. Valuing that is a different story, but I think it's a good starting point at least to sort of think about where are we not having any losses and damages. And this is talking not of human losses, but of course, on ecosystem losses at the point now. For human losses, that would be even more difficult, I think.
And there have been some studies, I mean, thinking about the tsunami, the most well-known studies looking into where have mangroves, not killed people out through the tsunamis. But it is true, it is difficult. You really need to see what are you looking at.
And there are some studies also putting value on the mangroves in terms of economic values, if we wanted to sort of look into what we're saving financially, which should interest the finance industry, I would imagine.
Hi, thanks for the great presentation. Peter de Boerta, Save the Children International. I like that you talked about risks around maladaptation. I was wondering if you had any thoughts or comments about how, in this context, especially short-term versus long-term, how to think about the limits of adaptation, perhaps from an agroforestry lens or more generally, and how that comes into this humanitarian development adaptation nexus. Thanks.
Oh yeah, it's a big question. There are many limits of agroforestry. Not all agroforestry, I also have to say, is nature-based solution, in my opinion. I think some of the limits are that it's perceived very technical in some cases. It seems to be fighting a little bit the same story as nature-based solutions is in terms of the name. some people, agroforestry wasn't, I mean, even for me, I come from Sweden, we did agroforestry, but I didn't know it was called agroforestry at the time. It was something else. It's just the land use. And so that can be one, the perception. I remember talking to local leaders who said, why are you Westerners always telling us to grow agroforestry? Here we do orange trees, or we do this and that. So there is a perception, and it has some resemblance to what nature-based solutions seems to be undergoing now. So that the technical aspect, and also knowing specifically what trees and crops and combinations to grow together, especially if you're introducing new trees, or when we're coming in now to more modified trees as well, then that's not working with nature perhaps, but it could be necessary, because some of the trees cannot fit in a warmer climate, and we may need more other varieties as well. And in the combination of these ones, it's very research intensive. Although I would say local people that we've worked with, they know a lot. And if we start with them, then we will have overcome some of the hurdles, I think. The biggest hurdle might be people in the middle level who sits on the money, then to convince them to invest.
Hi, thanks so much. My name's Alyssa. I work in the humanitarian space, formerly NGOs, now with the government. So I wanted to ask a question that maybe there are a few things that you might have thoughts on. So in terms of this balance of life-saving and kind of more resilience activities, something that we often run into is what's considered a priority in an extreme humanitarian response. And I feel like part of what's missing in that conversation is this comment that you made about upstream, downstream users. So tapping an aquifer that's shared by multiple communities, even if in one community there's a need for groundwater, might affect another community in a really catastrophic way. And so it's hard, first off, to communicate that, because obviously life-saving needs are going to be priority. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that balance. And then also, another thing we run into is administrative boundaries. There's this kind of like governance component when you have a space that goes over multiple areas where a downstream user will be affected, but they're in a different administrative location or in a different country. You know, there's a lot to unpack there, but those are some of the challenges we're talking about. Love to hear your thoughts.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree. I couldn't agree more. Actually, I think the way ministries collaborate, they might be working well in one province, but then, you have to talk to the neighbors or a neighboring country even, because water doesn't move at the administrative levels. So there's a lot to do there. And I think perhaps some people would agree that emergencies forces us to collaborate in some cases. And I've seen that happen myself. But it requires trust between ministries, different types of stakeholders, not only the government people's responsibilities, because the industry is also using the water. You talk about groundwater, for example, which could be used for industrial or factories and others who may have money to sort of to pay under the table for getting access to that water. It's a lot of things to do, I think. Yeah, bringing up the data, I guess, is one way to have it objectively shown to people what they need to do. If that's a solution everywhere, I couldn't say. Other than I agree with you, I just think we need to work more together. Somebody else said that already this morning too. We need to sit together at the same table. And my thinking behind the proposal of converging the conventions is exactly that too. I mean, the good thing perhaps is about being a poor country and a small country. Maybe you have to send the same negotiators to all of the 3 conventions. That could be good. But other than that, just going to the different conventions, I think, is splitting us up in our responses. And I think Yvonne will talk more about how we can do that later.
Great, that was a great segue for the next session. So a round of applause again for Elizabeth. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalie. So I've been tasked with just a few reflections on the keynote. I mean, this session really is about building bridges. The reason I asked you, which sector are you from? Because when I started in this field a long time ago, let's say 20 years ago, we would have either people from the environmental sector or disaster risk reduction, or climate change, not necessarily coming together in the same meeting. So there has been some progress. And I spent 20 years trying to build bridges between ministries of environment, ministries of emergency planning, ministries of disaster risk reduction and climate change, who wouldn't necessarily talk together. So at least we have in this room a good biodiversity of people. So this session really is about building bridges for growing positive change. And we heard from Elizabeth on the, let's say, the importance of coherence and alignment, but also NbS, nature-based solutions, as a bridge, right, between these different communities and framework agreements. But also, can we really scale up at the local level? That's tricky. But we can scale up our how-to, as Elizabeth mentioned. And unfortunately, what we've seen is it often takes a disaster and an emergency for things to change and for us to work together. Now, it shouldn't have to take a major disaster for things to really move forward, but maybe that's what we need, unfortunately. Let's try to prevent that, however. We also heard about NbS as being very useful for both prevention during a crisis and after a crisis. So the next session, now part of our session here, will be our panel. And our panel will build on Elizabeth's keynote to give further examples in local context, to highlight barriers and enabling factors for scaling up nature-based solutions, for climate change adaptation, disaster risk reduction at local, national, and international level. The objective really is to highlight action points and next steps that contribute to growing positive change. So we're now going to switch over to our panel, and we're going to start with Kevin, if we can have the slides back up. So Kevin just took on a new job yesterday, I understand. We can all congratulate him. I mean, not to put you on the spot or anything, but so Kevin is now a senior officer at Nature-Based Solutions at the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. But before that, you worked for the Jamaican Red Cross, and you will be sharing some of your experiences from at the Jamaican Red Cross. This session is going to be more of an interactive panel, so you'll only have 3 minutes. And then we'll go through each of the speakers. We have one online, and then we'll have question and answer, a little bit more of a dialogue. Over to you, Kevin. Thank you.
So we do consider the importance, for example, of the involvement of local communities within nature-based solutions and resilience building at the local community level overall. And so throughout the context in which we work as the Red Cross, we see ourselves, for example, as accompanying local communities rather than leading them. So accompanying them on their resilience building journey. Secondly, we seek to enable local communities, could be with resources, financial resources, or even technical resources. And of course, we also seek to connect them to government and to other entities that are able to sustain the work. So in Jamaica and in the Caribbean where I'm from, flooding and landslides are pretty much the two major hazards which has resulted in the most significant humanitarian impacts over the last 3 to 4 decades. And of course, the impacts of these hazards have been exacerbated by the destruction of the environment, including natural buffers such as mangroves and hillside forests and so on. And of course, sometimes the destructions are caused by the local community members themselves. For example, during agricultural practices and so on. So if the local communities are a part of the problem in some cases, then they must also be an integral part of the solutions as well. And so, of course, we ensure that local communities are very much involved at all levels of the process. So from the very engagement process. Also, for example, during the assessments. And so, of course, sometimes the assessments are lengthy, but of course, we have to keep the community engaged and be a part of that process. Also, in the very selection of the solutions to be implemented, the community must remain a critical part of that, as well as implementation and monitoring. So once the local communities remain as a critical part, then of course sustainability is more likely. And of course, I've seen many initiatives come apart because, of course, the local communities were not prioritized as much. And of course, one of the key ways in which we do that as well is that we form local community teams. So we may call them ecosystem disaster risk reduction teams, depending on the focus of the nature-based solutions. And so these are 25 to 30 persons, for example, who are trained, who are equipped, and so they act as guardians. They act as the ones who leads the initiative at the local level. And so these are also integrated, for example, into the parish mechanism, the governance mechanism within nature-based solutions. And so we see these as very, very critical components for longevity and for sustainability of nature-based solution initiatives.
Bang on time.
I think that was just about exactly 3 minutes, so well done. Our next panelist is Anissa, and Anissa is an assistant professor of disaster and climate risk reduction, risk governance for sustainability at the Environmental Governance Group, Copernicus Institute of Sustainable Development at Utrecht University. So actually the question to you, I forgot to ask your question, Kevin, but you went on anyway. Self-governance at the local level. What role do indigenous populations and local communities play in achieving effective and appropriate nature-based solutions? We have, I think, some examples from Indonesia. Over to you, Anissa. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karen. It's really a pleasure to be here. I think the conference really gives us space for being very reflective. So I really appreciate the organizer for this opportunity. So perhaps I would start with offering a new perspective to risk, because I think we need to really move away from this perception of risk as isolated or disaster as isolated event. It's systemic. So it's also accumulation of failed governance, failed action of human to cope and adapt to, and also to transform. So I'm a researcher, so the big part of my job is to understand, and I have the opportunity to actually do more research projects now in understanding the role of local community and also indigenous community in Indonesia. So I'm going to give one example of one of the project that I'm working on the role of indigenous community in Sulawesi. So have you been to Sulawesi in Indonesia before? Anyone? Yes, great. So it's a really biodiversity hotspot, let's say. I work in Banggai archipelago. So there are a lot of endemic species, Banggai crow, and also endemic fish, and also Banggai yam. All of these species are actually being threatened by land conversion. For example, for mining of limestone and also encroachment for palm oil. So then the community, so the indigenous community that I work with called Sea tribe. So they're already living in Banggai for generations. They have their rituals, they have their traditions, they protect their forest. They have sacred place where they believe that it's their place of birth, let's say. So even if you want to get in, you have to do days of rituals to get permission to get in. But what happened is that there's a lack of recognitions from the government. I will talk about the challenges later on, but I think we need to really look into more of their roles of protecting the environment as safeguard of environment, let's say. And one of the unique things is also about the indigenous community self-governance. So when you hear the word governance, you usually think about government, but no. Indigenous community also have the rights to govern themselves. So that's why I think it's really useful to think, especially me as a researcher and also maybe project implementer or designer, to think about the same role of knowledge from the indigenous community when you talk about finding solutions, like what Kevin said. It's really crucial for us to recognize and also to think about how to balance well-being of the community and also their efforts to actually conserve the environment. Without them, we'll be lost, I think, in terms of our biodiversity conservation goal. So maybe that's it. Thank you.
Great, right on cue. We now have online, we have Gonzalo Gutierrez Goizeta, who is a nature-based solutions specialist with the World Bank and one of the core members of the global program on nature-based solutions for climate resilience. So question to you, this morning we talked quite a lot about finance and financing NbS. So in your opinion, who is paying for nature-based solutions projects and who should pay to reach scale? Over to you, Gonzalo. Thanks for joining.
So hello, everyone from Spain. I'm super quick, bit sad that I couldn't be there in person with you all, but I'm moving from one city to another with two small children. So I'm sure you can imagine the chaos I have around here. But yes, coming back to the finance side and who's paying for NBSs, I think the first message I want to convey is that nature-based solutions in general, we are seeing that have great potential to secure investments, mainly, and I'm sure you have discussed that on previous sessions, or you're gonna discuss that on next ones. There are multi-beneficial solutions. They have the capacity to attract a diversity of thematic funding. I'm working more on the climate adaptation, disaster risk reduction side, but if we talk about climate mitigation, biodiversity, sustainable infrastructure, etc., so many entry points to help to solve important global challenges, to deliver social benefits, and therefore secure existing public funds. And that explains that currently the funding landscape for nature-based solutions projects is pretty diverse, but the public sector, including governments, but also multilateral development institutions, are still the major contributors. And this public funding is vital, and it will always be, but it only kind of scratches the surface of what is really needed. The reality is that, and depending a little bit on the estimations and the source, but more or less around 80 to 85% of financing for NBSs come from these public sources, and only around 20–50% currently comes from the private side. And this is mainly because NBSs are still commonly regarded as public goods, and it's kind of normal. I mean, the benefits, the huge benefits they bring to communities, to society, but especially the fact that, I mean, it is difficult for the private sector to make a profit from them, because many of these benefits currently have no financial market values. And as you said before, this is kind of normal because nature is much more than profit, but it's also a big challenge because public money, and we all know, is scarce, and there is a lot of competition. That is why we need to kind of develop, we call them business models in the jargon, but the idea is to try to leverage those available public funds through finance vehicles to solutions with the ability to attract more private investors. And I really believe we need to incentivize private sector participation. We want to see more NbS implementation, at least in this current economic system we live in. And the good news is that we're seeing that. So if the necessary conditions can be established, many times nature-based solutions can also be cost-effective opportunities for the private sector. Of course, there are some sectors that is more evident, like water management, maybe tourism, agriculture, sometimes it's more evident than in others, but it is possible. So just in short and to finish, so a diverse finance landscape, but also a great opportunity with many different entry points and an increasing investment appetite from different countries, from different sectors, but also still existing challenges to scale that implementation, especially when financing or co-financing is needed from the private sector side.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Gonzalo. We go back to the next slide. Yes. So I had the pleasure of introducing Yvonne, who is the head of Environmental Vulnerability and Ecosystem Services Division at United Nations University Institute for Environment and Human Security. And Yvonne, we've talked quite a lot about upscaling nature-based solutions. So this is your question. You will not have an easy task, but I'm sure you do well. Entry points at the policy and planning level. Over to you, Yvonne.
Yeah, thank you so much. And first of all, good afternoon, everyone. And a big thank you to also the organizers for providing this amazing space of 3 days to talk and discuss about growing positive change. I think this is really amazing. We talked this morning about scaling NbS with integrity, and if we ask now the question on how to upscale NbS, I think we can turn this a little bit around and say that actually integrity at policy and planning could be the entry point actually to upscale. Building on this, I think we discussed also, and we agree that NbS is an umbrella term, which has a lot of approaches under it, which is on the one hand a huge opportunity to integrate, or as we learned today, also to bridge between different approaches. But if it comes to the concrete planning and implementation level, it really comes to a challenge, because it's really, we need to then make sure at the implementation or planning and implementation level, NbS for what? To achieve what? What goals do we want to achieve? So and this is where we have these different approaches like EcoDRR or EBA to address different goals. Now, what are entry points at the policy and planning level? At the policy level, there's actually one experience we were making in terms of learning that the parties of the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification agreed at the last COP15 in Côte d'Ivoire that they want to make sure that these terminologies are clarified and understood well in order to leverage synergies and understand very well what are coherences and what are differences. And therefore, we were tasked with a study from UNCCD to really do exactly research on coherence and alignment among these approaches: sustainable land management, ecosystem-based adaptation, ecosystem-based disaster risk reduction, and also nature-based solutions. What was confirmed in this study is that nature-based solutions is an umbrella term, as an overarching term. But what was also clear at this study is that each of these individual approaches have specific targets and goals, which makes them specific and different. But if it comes to the implementation and also planning level, they all go using sustainable land management technologies. They are all having participatory approaches, and it's all about managing land right at one place or an ecosystem. So what is actually needed at the planning level is to understand well the challenges and make sure when we implement and we plan that we address such approaches in a way that we can leverage co-benefits and relate them to the challenges such as disasters, climate change, biodiversity, land degradation, food security, etc., to look at one piece of land in order to address them and tailor them in a targeted way. And I see my time is over.
Okay, over to you. So if we could get the we'll clap up. Yes. Over to you, Natalie.
A variety of different inputs, kind of looking from the local level to the global level on nature-based solutions for disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation, different perspectives. And before moving into the, what are some of the enablers and challenges that you can see for implementing nature-based solutions for disaster risk reduction, would love to get your input. So we're trying out WooClap. You can either, if it works, scan the QR code, or you can go to wooclap.com and we have the event code. And so the question that we're asking you to reflect on and provide a word is, what do you think are the main challenges of implementing nature-based solutions in humanitarian or DRR or CCA contexts? What are some of the challenges? What are your experiences? The financing is in big red right now. I think that feels appropriate. We saw governance, land ownership, belief, corruption. Lots of words coming in: political will, private land.
Financing is holding its ground. Okay, maybe we have people. Well, I think we just need to have people to stop at some point. You guys have too many ideas.
Yeah.
We're going to be fascinated by this all afternoon. Okay, can you stop having ideas now, please? Okay. All right.
So that was very unilateral and not very democratic, but we saw that I think some of the key words that were coming up were financing and governance.
You can leave that up. If you can stop having ideas.
In the larger points.
Governance is pretty strong.
And we're going to now, maybe with your input, this might spark some of our panelists to kind of give their perspectives on challenges and maybe enablers. And once again, you've got 3 minutes each. So Kevin.
Thank you. In terms of challenges, a few that I've come across, one, sometimes it's difficult to get institutional and sometimes even local community buy-in and a belief that nature-based solutions really work and that they're worth the time and the investment. So you may go to a local community, for example, who is struggling with coastal flooding, and you undertake a program to restore mangroves and so on, and they may say, well, we wish you had money for a seawall instead. So, there's this desire for instantaneous, and as was said earlier, if nature-based solutions work, sometimes, the limited flooding may not be associated with it. So sometimes it's hard to know when something worked to prevent something that didn't happen. Also, a real problem that we're facing in Jamaica is navigating land tenure and permit issues. So, for example, we're seeking to restore maybe less than 10 hectares of critical mangrove stock. But that small plot of land, you need permit from 3 different government agencies who sometimes don't talk with each other. And so that, has led to significant delays and, so the land tenure issue is very, very critical. Additionally, as well, the access to funding for localized nature-based solution initiatives is very much limited. So a number of these critical challenges really are facing us, and of course, as some of those which came up from the audience. In terms of institutional positions, it may just not be that area of priority. And of course, what may happen as well too is that you may go through a particular mode of action with a community, even with governance support and so government support, and then you may have, for example, a change in government, or there may be a change in leadership, and so that which was of importance, that which may have even been decided, would of course now has been pushed to the back burner. And then of course there's always the greater clamor, as I said, for something that is instantaneous. We did this, or we installed this or installed that, and because sometimes one has to wait to see the benefits, or the mangroves that will take time to grow, or the trees will take time to grow. Sometimes it is just not the most desired kind of intervention. So these are some of the main challenges which we have come across, which sometimes is difficult to navigate, but of course, we continue to press on.
Great, thank you. Anissa.
Yes, I was about to say institutionalization, but you already mentioned that. So I think for me, it's about lack of diversification of knowledge. Especially, I'm being very reflective on my role as a researcher, especially in the global north. Let's say I come from Indonesia, and I feel like still lack of research trying to understand culture and our communities, and it's being valued less, especially when we talk about the discourse of nature-based solution, technical intervention, international development, etc. So I still get this question also in some of meetings about research project, if I see indigenous knowledge as science. It's quite a very triggering question for me because if we talk about arguments of validity, for example, indigenous knowledge also have its own validity. It stays up to now, it stays relevant. and it stays useful as well, especially when you talk about environmental conservation, human-nature relations, etc. So I think we need more and more awareness of the importance of transdisciplinarity. The importance of research for societal impact. I don't know, many of you, maybe also researchers here, can reflect also on this as well, and see that nature-based solutions is not only about, you know, a term that you use to get funding, but also to leverage impact, let's say. Nature as connector as it is, like meaningfully. And I think also in terms of opportunities as well to actually look into, for example, formalization of law of indigenous community. In many countries, we have already good examples. Maybe the challenge is the implementation gaps, but many of the countries, for example, in Indonesia, it has not been fully recognized. So I think that is also a homework for science policy interface, or whatever you name it. It's very fancy words. But really to look into leverage opportunities to bring diverse voices to inform policy making, I think. I will not take 1 minute more, so I will just give the floor to Gonzalo. Okay, sorry.
Okay, so on my side, a little bit more on the, maybe on the finance or private sector engagement side. I mean, nature-based solutions projects, especially when implemented at larger scale, are always complex. But if I have to highlight maybe, and I saw it, I think a question in the chat that is kind of connected with the challenge to have those I don't know, business cases or the challenge that are preventing more substantial investment in these solutions, and this is at least based on my experience and what I'm seeing in my work. I think I will highlight. First thing is, I think from the private side, we see that's a little bit the answer we got when we talk with the private sector. Return on investment is not evident yet. I think projects often generate multiple co-benefits and positive externalities. We clearly see that in our work, even if in our economic assessments, our cost-benefit analysis that we know are pretty limited, but even with those, we see that the positive impact can be huge. However, the commercial return on investment often does not justify normally higher transaction costs and sometimes also higher risks, especially in the longer term. And as I said before, some sectors have more clear or direct revenue streams, like maybe agriculture, forestry, but many projects may not generate income in the traditional sense when talking about carbon absorption or sometimes in hazard mitigation projects. So to make, I think, these projects more attractive, we still need to work on creating the risking mechanisms to support the sector until it reaches maturity. And we are seeing that emergence of some innovative instruments, those green bonds, water funds that are working pretty well in Latin America. We have been talking about carbon offsets and now about biodiversity offset for a while. I think all those mechanisms really try to combine different financing sources. They try to leverage existing grants or concessional money, and they also try to incorporate different revenue streams in the project financial structure. And I think there we can find some good opportunities to attract the private actors and to build this required sustainable financing structure. So that's maybe one big challenge, that lack of difficulty to get the return on investment or show the return on investment to the private sector. The other thing, and I think is also key, is we still have a pretty limited proven track record of successful investments. As many NbS approaches are still sometimes novel or have been implemented only on smaller scale or maybe on very concrete contexts. Some of the existing data, and I'm talking here especially on financial data, but also when we talk about effectiveness, some of the data relies heavily on anecdotal evidence or academic theory. And that's still another important obstacle to convince decision makers and to attract investment. And I think to attract that large scale private but also public capital, we really need data-driven impact measurement and to build stronger evidence and to demonstrate the impact of these projects. And just to frame personally, I think that we are starting to create that track record, that stronger portfolio of projects. It takes time because these projects need long time frames, but that track record will rapidly attract others. And I hope to see a bit like a snowball effect. And I'm done. Sorry, I don't see the time, so I'm probably more than 3 minutes. Sorry for that.
Thank you so much. So I would now reflect quickly on barriers and enablers to leverage synergies in policy and planning. And I would want to start with barriers to end with a positive note, actually. So what is very clear and what we heard often enough already in the course of today is that there are really sectoral approaches from the international level in terms of policy, but also at the national level in terms of planning. So all the countries are actually facing this huge burden of addressing a national adaptation plan, a national biodiversity plan, land degradation neutrality assessment, etc., etc. So there are a lot of planning instruments, which is good because then they can bring things forward, but they are in sectors. And this means planning at a sector level means you're thinking also on a sectoral level, which is also a problem when it comes to implementation and to leverage synergies. What also is one actually issue, a key barrier, what we learned this morning is that we have a value crisis. Actually, I want to jump on this message because all this is made on one-dimensional value lens. So mainly focusing either on economic, so what is the human benefit of a policy or a planning, and what is actually or what is the conservation benefit, let's say. So it's really increasing this dichotomy between instrumental versus intrinsic values, and where this is actually bridging kind of to the enablers. And what I think what would be a key enabler is to make it very crystal clear that this interlink, that actually only healthy ecosystems are the basis and the fundament that we can have social and human well-being and sustainable development. So I think this is something which would need to be understood as a fundamental basis, and then that we can build on this with a pluralistic valuation where we get the diverse perspectives mapped out and understood well. That we have actually, it's actually people are looking very differently on a forest, for example, and that this is kind of considered and creates also ownership at the local level. If we have this basis transparent and known these diverse values, we can also make conscious decisions on trade-offs. And we always have trade-offs. We always have to make a decision whether we go for focus now on climate change adaptation, or focus on disaster risk reduction, or focus on food security. But we do it interconnected and make sure that we think about these diverse aspects at the same time, because we look at one piece of land actually, and this is important that we consider these things. And one key entry point as an enabler is also that this is considered by donors, for example. If any projects on NbS are funded, that multiple aspects are considered as safeguards, that we don't fund only EBA projects or only eco-DRR projects or only conservation projects, but that we think from a donor perspective to ensure that we have social ecological systems perspective as a fundamental underlying criteria for implementation characteristics. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Yvonne. And we'll start off the, let's say this now, discussion section. As I'm actually going to turn to Elizabeth and surprise her with, do you have any thoughts from what you've heard so far?
I was thinking about what the previous session where we talked about health, and it makes me think that in the CGIR, which is the Consultative Group of International Agriculture Research, we talk about One Health, which is humans, animals, and nature. And the previous session obviously also talks about this, but uses a different name. And I think this is how we are interlinked or not interlinked between our different research areas as well. We just need to talk to each other across our research areas. For me, I'm a geographer. For me, it comes natural to think of the past of a place, of the history and the future. But of course, not everybody thinks like me. And it's so interesting every time I hear a different perspective on the same issues that we're talking about today. So that's just a reflection out of the blue. It didn't answer your question, but I was just stuck thinking about this as we had the previous talks here.
I'm going to start off with a question online because we have online. I think this is a really interesting question on financing, and it's be open, I think, to everyone. So the question is, what are your thoughts on power dynamics linked to funding in relation to the now often mentioned importance of including and involving local communities on equal levels? A rather deep question, but important question. So I think that the point, well, at least the way I see it is, I mean, in terms of the power dynamics of funding, right? Often we have, I don't know, an NbS project. We give money to an organization to go in, and yes, they work with local communities, but where does the funding actually go, right? It goes to the organization, doesn't necessarily go to the local communities. And in fact, a report last year, I think, came out by IFRC showing that, you know, the adaptation funds do not reach the most vulnerable and local people. So, you know, how is this linked? What can we change? Any reflections? I see Kevin nodding.
Yes, that's a really good question. Yes, and in many respects, I think in many ways sometimes we only really pay lip service to the involvement of local communities. So informing communities, for example, of what is going to happen is really not local community involvement, or having one or two members of the community together with the project team, for example. And so we need to get to a place where there is decision-making power is placed within the local communities, and that the local communities are there throughout the process, not merely, as I said, just merely informing that something is going to happen. And so, in terms of project design, for example, the project may need to be designed in a particular way that gives credence to the local community, and that local community involvement is paramount. And so, for example, as I said, there should be, you know, decision-making power within that. So in the Red Cross movement, for example, the assessment processes which we carry out, such as the enhanced vulnerability and capacity assessment, is really community-centered. And so the project, for example, that we worked with in Jamaica with the Nature Conservancy, when we go into the local communities, you may have some ideas, but you don't go with a platter of solutions, in that the threats and so on, and even the solutions themselves, ought to come from the local community, because no one knows the community better than those who live and occupy the space. So we should, you know, have project design and implementation adjusted to really have local community involvement, so as to tilt that power dynamic, so that the local community really do have decision-making power right throughout the process.
Requires also donor flexibility to be with uncertainty as to what, you know, they won't know to begin with, where does the community want to invest, and that is difficult. I think that requires a shift, a mind shift in the donor community.
Yes, and definitely the Resilient Islands project was funded by the German government, really gave us that. Because, as I said at the beginning of the project, what nature-based solutions are you going to implement? We don't know. That will come from the engagement of the local communities, from the engagement of the partners. And so definitely the donor flexibility is there. And also sometimes engaging communities may take time. One community may take several weeks or months to engage and be on board properly. And so the donor may be saying, you know, the burn rate is slow, or we want to get on with the project, but we have not properly engaged and connected with the community as yet. And so definitely that flexibility is certainly needed. And lastly, I may say, it is very difficult, for example, for a 2-year or 3-year nature-based solutions project. because within the first year, for example, you've just started to engage the community. And for you to implement and have results and so on within 3 years is is a very, very difficult thing. And so we may need to look at that and realistically, can we have a 3-year nature-based solutions project? What do we expect to have at the end of 3 years? You know, we don't just simply want ceremonial things or just photo ops. We really want significant and serious intervention. And so if that is the case, we may need to really look at that to have realistic timeframes and realistic expectations concerning these initiatives.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to add the time element. Like, I think it would be great if the funding system really give this flexibility of more longitudinal type of projects, right? It's not like, okay, we have 3 years and then we have to figure out if we can have more funding. That's what usually happen. But local community also have expectation indeed. Like, it's not just about implementing project and leave. So it's beyond that. And I think also in terms of working within the system, because most of the challenge is also about bureaucracy, right? I mean, you have to go through the government, and then they would tell you where to go, for example, and sometimes it doesn't reach the community. So it also needs a push from bottom up. That means that the community itself has to have capacity to self-govern and push for their own voice and agenda. And so, yeah, you cannot do that in 3 weeks. You need years. And yeah, it's really crucial then to really try to see, like, strategically how to plan a project that can really facilitate this longitudinal type of engagement.
Thank you. Any question from the room? We have a lady here.
This is less of a question, but more of a reflection, and I can talk about why I bring this up. My name is Twinkle, and I work with this private equity fund called Climate Asset Management, and we invest in nature-based solutions, primarily in emerging markets, but also regen, ag, and forestry projects in more traditional developed markets. And we were talking about projects just now and how communities can be involved locally, and I thought it might be helpful to bring an example of a project where we've managed to do this somewhat successfully. So this is a project in Africa. It's called the Restore Africa program, covers 3 countries, Kenya, Uganda, and Malawi. One of the ways in which we thought we can best integrate communities within the program is by benefit sharing, which is revenue sharing of the project itself. So the minute the project would achieve some kind of net revenue, that money would then be allocated towards a trust, and the board of that trust would comprise of members of local communities who are typically chiefs of the local tribes, and then they would then decide where this money would then be allocated. So we've had these local chiefs allocate money towards building schools, for example, or building hospitals, and this is still the project is still fairly young. We're in, I think, year 4 or year 5 of the project, and it's a 40-year project with certain milestones associated at different times of this entire 40-year program. But yeah, just wanted to highlight that private financing is very much capable and interested, I think, in designing these solutions, but the challenge typically is identifying the right local proponents who can help build these structures in place. And if the right local proponent is identified, it's actually quite beneficial to everyone, including the communities.
Is there any specific question, or you wanted to give mainly a comment? Okay.
So I have a question online that for all panelists from Marta Vicarelli. So the question is following up on Gonzalo's comment. In order to encourage participation of the private sector to support transformative upscaling of nature-based solutions, we need better estimation of the economic benefits of NbS. Successful economic valuation will require interdisciplinary dialogue and participation of local stakeholders, including indigenous groups. So the question, now we come to the question, what are, in your opinion, the biggest challenges to effective or comprehensive economic valuation of the benefits of nature-based solutions? I see Yvonne, and then afterwards Gonzalo.
Okay, I actually thank you for that, Marta, for this question. I would want to mention that we are currently working together with UNFCCC, the Warsaw International Mechanism, on a report on non-economic losses of loss of biodiversity and loss of ecosystem services. And especially focusing on non-economic losses, we realize in this little research that if we lose ecosystem services or if we lose biodiversity, we have actually cascading losses, which can not really be economically quantified and which would be neglected if we would have a cost-benefit analysis as a standalone output in terms of valuation. And I think this is actually something I want to mention. So there are, what we have there is, for example, livelihoods, which you can still quantify also in economic terms. But another thing, what we also have there is human well-being, which is very difficult to put in economic terms. Another thing is security. So we are actually, if we have, for example, rely on groundwater and the groundwater is going to be lost, or if you rely on water from glacier in the mountain area and this is going to be lost due to climate change, for example, we have a security issue also, no? And I think this is something we should mention, that if we have also degraded land, we have a security issue. Another thing is what is actually cascading in this regard is also that we have also an issue of opportunities. So we lose a lot of opportunities if we lose biodiversity, for example. Thinking just about the but antibiotics, for example, which have saved our lives like 80 years long, which is just an invention out of nature, and things like this are opportunities we don't know about yet, but we are losing them if we lose biodiversity. And these are things we should also consider, and there's no way to measure them in economic terms. And I think if we have standalone economic assessments, this is really then we close the box saying it's valued, and I think this is a high risk. That's what I wanted to mention.
Thank you, Gonzalo. You wanted to add something?
Yes, thank you. No, indeed, that another interesting question here, because it's always a complex issue, no? This or the economic value, or trying to put a value on nature. It's let's say always a tricky thing. I think, and we work also at the bank. We published last year a report specifically on assessing the cost and benefits of nature-based solutions. I think the first thing is we do not yet include well nature in most benefit cost analysis, but we have seen, and this is evolving every year, we do have the tools now to value more or less rigorously several key benefits from nature in these assessments. But most people don't know it yet and don't using them, project managers, economists. It's true that sometimes we kind of overwhelm project managers or investors when we show a huge list of ecosystem services that we think they should consider. But I think, and this is important, there are already small number of benefits or service that have, and we're seeing that in our assessment, major economic impacts. And I'm talking about, I would say these critical benefits are hazard mitigation, especially when we talk about flood and erosion. Water regulation also, we can pre-estimate the value of that and can have great impacts on the project, actually the project impacts. I think also carbon sequestration and maybe also recreation. I think those services can be more or less valued, and we should use them or include them to really at least try to put a value or make people understand the potential scale of the value of nature. And of course, I think the main challenge here is the higher uncertainties. We're talking about estimations. We're talking about something that is not actual facts. And with climate change, we're also development uncertainties in general. This is very complex, and we need to really acknowledge that when we make those studies and make people understand also that.
Thanks, Gonzalo. Do you have another question or comment in the room? We have the lady down here. I don't know if there was anybody right at the top.
There's one up there over there in the back. The top, no.
Do you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Now, I have actually a question on how you would see the role of insurance companies in this topic and disaster risk reduction, while we're also talking about finance. So I know it's a broad question, and maybe you could elaborate on that.
Well, I've worked with agriculture insurance a long time back, and I think insurance business are really interesting to bring along because they know what risk is and they want to minimize risk. So to get them involved in understanding what nature-based solutions can do might probably be the best way to actually convince other investors as well. Easy as that, I think.
Yeah, and there is some interesting research out there, or TNC in particular has done some really good work with Swiss Re, where they've, I think they've done several, but the one that is the most well known is they got an insurer to insure a coral reef off the coast somewhere in Mexico, and that payouts are distributed after a certain wind speed so that they can go and restore the reef because the reef is protecting the town. And I think I remember last time I had a conversation from Swiss Re that there was also, they were looking at other types of products like that.
Yeah, thanks for reminding me. There is also this index insurance that is paying out before some kind of weather event would happen, which makes it actually easier for farmers to take measures before the damage is there already. So that kind of insurances also exist.
So we have, finally, we have someone right at the top. And a microphone is running towards you as we speak.
Now the pressure's on to say something. Actually, I am with TNC, and I am connected. My name is Daniel Morchain, and I'm connected to that piece of work on insurance that you mentioned. So I wanted to add to it. So thanks for adding the information. I'll only add that for us, one of the key things we want to do in advancing and really exploring if this model is something that has how should we expand it? How should this be expanded? Is to really understand the potential direct benefits that communities and local actors, let's say, can have or not. And also recognizing that this is a model that is founded on buying insurance, something very few people, let's say, percentage-wise in the world can afford. So it's not a matter of people purchasing that insurance, but creating a mechanism where that is sustainable financially in the long term, that there is a benefit for, or let's say there is a good reason for people to buy that insurance, whether it is local governments and others, and to feel that that can be done not only in the Cancun related areas when you're protecting coral reefs, but also in other areas where there are no big industry or big tourism industry, big assets, big valuable dollar figure assets, but also where they are most needed. So that's the kind of connection between nature insurance and the need to connect to the needs of communities and really deliver direct benefits to these communities that we are really digging deep into, not only with the insurance sector companies, but also with like I was saying, like local governments and other actors that need to play a key role here for this to work more than, for 1 year or 2 years, then either the funding runs out or the interest shifts. Thank you.
Great, thank you for adding that. And I think it's a very good point. I think we have one last question at the back, lady in white.
It's really interesting to have all these insights. I do work now in an NGO in Bolivia, and we work actually in conservation, but that there is very related to nature-based solutions and trying to go for these solutions that will also impact them and give them benefits. But my question is a little bit more onto there is always this trade-off decisions in terms of what are you going to do with this piece of land. And it's always a struggle to try to fight against what the alternative is. In the cases in the Chaco, for instance, in the south of Bolivia, it's a lot of cattle productions. No? So you're trying to quantify the benefits for them, and it's not only a matter of giving monetary and maybe also all the other benefits, but you are using a comparison. So I don't know if there are studies or approaches going to the trade-off, like comparing. So this is what you gain, but this is what you lose, because they're looking a little bit more into they're losing the opportunity of the cattle production, for instance, which is in that sense very cheap to just put a cattle there, and they don't really need to do a lot of handwork, and it's kind of an investment. So in that case, it's a very clear example, but I don't know if there are other examples where they study against another solution, against another possibility that it's not nature-based solution, for example.
Thank you. So any studies that I know or tools to measure trade-offs, Yvonne?
Yeah, it's not a study, but a concept. It's the Land Degradation Neutrality Framework, which is actually rolled out by the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification, where they have as the guidance is that there are 3 key indicators on land degradation, which are monitored at the national level, and the ambition or the overall goal is that at least there's no net degradation, and there's actually the ambition to even increase loss of degradation. And what they do is actually that they look at the ecosystem specific level. If you degrade a forest in one area of a country, you need to conserve or restore forests in another area of country, and this is a way of balancing trade-offs in terms of you always have to balance between food security, conservation, and all the other challenges we have in terms of climate, disasters, etc. And I think this is also cultural backgrounds consider this, and this is actually one framework which is working with trade-offs in a spatial explicit way in relation to specific ecosystems.
Great. Any other question or thought? I think we'll leave questions, but if there's any thoughts related to trade-offs, happy to hear. Because it is an important question, trade-offs, especially in difficult situations when we're thinking of food security, water security, or even just physical security. So I'll leave that thought, and we'll be moving on to so what can we do next?
Right, so hold that question because it might be appropriate for the last section. So guys, and gals, there's 25 minutes left between now and dinner. And we would like to ask one more question. We're getting to the section on next steps. So if you like to, you guys really got into that intergenerational bridging. If you'd like to go shake the hand again of your neighbor or somebody with gray hair, please do so while we get that up on the board. So we're looking, you guys really got into that, didn't you?
I'll shake your hand.
Oh, there we go. So we're doing a lot of building bridges, intergenerational connectedness. So if you could go to the last, you really love that. This should be a tradition. So let's see, the next and last question is, what are practical next steps? We're moving into the last part of this session. So go ahead, you were really good at ideas. So once again, go to wooclap.com, use that code FFCMSQ. And I have no doubt that you will have, what did it say, go to dinner? Next steps, somebody is really, you guys are cheeky, come on. You are very cheeky. Okay, the message is loud and clear. Let's see. Well, naturally, we won't have really good concrete steps for policy other than go to dinner. We're trying to help
But Karen, go to dinner means networking. It means discussion. It
Right.
means community. It means friendship.
We do have community practices evolving. Drinks are evolving as well. Okay. Let's see, what is that one? All right, NbS, humanity. Okay, you're starting to have too many ideas. Go to dinner is the prevalent idea here. Okay, so as you decide on the next strategy, let's take a look.
So yeah, I'm definitely going to go to dinner as a sign of getting together in community, right? So that's what we're gonna take from that. And maybe we can ask the panel to reflect on other possibilities for next steps than going to dinner.
Invite Elizabeth, other than going to dinner, if you have any other ideas and practical, help me out here, because I have to summarize this part of the conversation. Over to you, Elizabeth.
Well, I think actually it shows how important food security is. I do think working together are practical next steps, like we've talked to our neighbors here, just interact with others and talk about things. There's so many negative news in the world, and I think just talking to people, doing things on a very practical level in your communities back home or together with other people, other groups, just get engaged and do something is better than doing absolutely nothing. And the second thing I would like to add, for those of you who have gray hair, think about where you put your retirement money. Just what that goes to, where it's invested, I mean by that. Yeah.
Yvonne, you could like to go ahead.
Should I go? Okay. Practical next steps. So I'm coming from a scientific perspective. I think science has the opportunity to build these bridges and to leverage this coherence by making it very clear based on arguments and facts. And I'm imagining now what for me would be a very nice vision, a practical vision, also which could be realized potentially, is that, for example, we bring together these scientific bodies like the IPCC and the IPBES and the SPI from the UNCCD to make sure that there's maybe a joint report on actionable measures to address these diverse goals at the same time, because science is already, if you look at these individual reports, it's so crystal clear that if you have healthy ecosystems, you can mitigate and adapt to climate change, you can address disaster risk, and you ensure that you combat the loss of biodiversity. Other way around, if you degrade land, it's going the other way, the spiral is going the other way around. And in order to get there, I think that we do this roll out in a more systematic way, this pluralistic and diverse valuation of nature to create ownership at the local level even, to make sure that we have these diverse values transparent and visible and acknowledge them. I think this is actually a basis for all these decision-making processes and also for the ongoing loss and damage debate, which we have in the context of climate change mitigation and addressing loss and damage of climate change. If we know what we value, we know what we lose, and we can prioritize. That's my way.
Okay, great. I think we can go to Gonzalo. We've seen now drinks have taken over, go to dinner. And let's shift over to Gonzalo for thoughts on next steps. If we can, let's get you online, Gonzalo. Wait, there we go. Okay, over to you, please.
No, I'll also focus on two things that I think are very important. I think we have kind of mentioned it already, especially what Yvonne just mentioned and Elizabeth also mentioned before. But I think that could really help to approach these projects in a different way. The first thing, as we heard, we need to stop to think about environmental societal problems in an isolated way. I am still seeing every day how we tend to look at NbS projects from one perspective, flood mitigation or land regeneration, carbon sequestration, as we just said. That is somehow needed. We talked about that there are always trade-offs. We need to prioritize our objectives, but we also need more integrated projects. I'm talking more about infrastructure projects, but in every sector, because we need those multi-objective approaches that might require they require normally, because we're seeing that sometimes higher initial investments in some cases. However, those initial costs also come with the potential to generate much higher societal, economic, and environmental benefits in the long term. So really, that idea to maximize the advantage of nature-based solution, we need to have a more holistic perspective and try to identify all the existing synergies of these projects. And the second thing, and I think it was also mentioned before, and I think it was interesting, is that we talked that we need much more collaboration. We probably also need much more flexibility, but we also need some level of risk tolerance if we want to kind of scale NbS investment and implementation. And I say that we need to assume some risk because when we talk about more finance or we talk about engaging with the private sector, that often come together with risks. And we talked about the challenge of ensuring distributional equity, how we're gonna benefits and costs are distributed, or how equity in decision making, as we mentioned, but also the potential risk of greenwashing. And we are already seeing that in some cases we find how low quality projects or maybe lack of monitoring is pretty frequent, also holding real positive impacts on biodiversity, for example. However, in my opinion, if we want the huge talent and the financial power of the private sector, we need to acknowledge those risks. Of course, we need to try to prevent them, but we have to avoid being paralyzed by them. Because I think, personally, I think the only way that we will see like a massive implementation of this space is through private initiatives.
I think for me it's about sincerity. Back to your point of this openness of discussion, let's say. It's very important to think about the reflection of community, indigenous community, local community, researchers, scientists, NGOs who are working on pushing NbS agenda towards impact, and maybe think about two concepts: resilience and resistance. Try to understand what does that means to people, right? And yeah, maybe as a researcher, I think we need to alternate between fast and slow science to really capture this human nature relations. Of course, I understand like policy cannot wait, but I think we need both worlds to actually understand the complexity. Don't be afraid to bring forward complexity and politicizing, like the panel, the first keynote mentioned. Because without talking about politics, power dynamic, complexity, you don't actually solve anything. So it's best to bring that forward than neglect it and then totally lost on the vision and the goals. Maybe that's.
One quick thing is that before any implementation of nature-based solutions for whatever societal challenge or so on is targeted, that there is an attempt to understand the, for example, level of indigenous knowledge or the attitudes, for example, of the local community surrounding that ecosystem. I'll give you one quick example. We did a knowledge, attitude, and practices survey within the largest fishing community in Jamaica. We were targeting mangrove restoration. And one thing that jumped out at us from the survey was that a large portion of the community saw the mangroves primarily as a mosquito breeding site. So for them, the mangroves meant more mosquitoes. And so you have to deal with that before you go ahead and begin to restore and to replant and so on, because the sustainability of it is going to be threatened. And so I think that should be a firm part of every intervention, that the attitudes, the practices, of the local community be understood and somehow be incorporated into the actions over the long term.
Well, thank you. So with that, a few concluding words, and then we'll hand over to Natalie to close for the day, since going for drinks was a big priority for this group. But what I heard, and in terms of practical steps, I mean, let me just, a quick reflection. I've been in this field for almost 20 years, and in the very beginning, nobody was listening to us at all, that nature and disaster risk reduction had anything to do with each other. I also want to recognize my colleagues at IUCN, the Commission on Ecosystem Management, with whom we've been working for a long time to bring this to the forefront. There's been a lot of progress. It may not be fast enough, But I remain positive, and I do think that we have made a lot of progress over the last 2 decades in this field. And so standing here today, I'm very proud to see this panel and this very interdisciplinary crowd saying that we need to continue working together. We need greater alignment of these policy frameworks, right? We need to continue building bridges. We've heard many of these things before, but they really are starting to come together. But the alignment of the international policy frameworks, I think, is a very important next step. We heard a lot today about the importance of not just indigenous knowledge as being an add-on, but it's part of the very essence of nature-based solutions. So that's a starting point, not a last point. And working with communities from the very beginning together in building projects that need to be longer term. So that's another very important next practical step, is requesting that donors give longer periods, longitudinal projects, because nature needs room, nature needs space, nature needs time. We need to work with nature, right? But we need to give it time. Assuming risk. So working with the private sector, who will be assuming that risk, however, is a good question. I remember when I was here 2 years ago, I learned a lot from hearing from the Bank of America, who was one of the panelists, right? And talking about we need to work together and to see who can assume risk. Can governments help to assume risk? And investing in government de-risking can be an extremely important and valuable contribution of public funds. So with that, I hand over to Natalie, if you want to say anything else, and then we'll hand over to Natalie Sudden to close. Thank you.
Yeah, I think the reflections from, today, but also in particular this panel, humanitarian crises are really complex, multifactorial situations. And, I think in some cases we may have, as an environmental group, oversold maybe the simplicity of the solution. When we talk about nature-based solutions, it is not as simple as you have heard. It requires so many factors to be put into play, not with the least, really working with the emotions, with the thoughts and knowledge of the people and the whole of society around them. And I think this is something we need to start to get better at communicating and working with people on these complex situations, as was also said earlier this morning, because it's together we can, and I agree with Karen, we can kind of start to chart a path out of some of these humanitarian crises, but we can't do that if we just lie to ourselves that it is a simple question. It is a complex question that requires heart, soul, and mind to be engaged. So that's from me. Thank you.
Thank you. Should we move?
Yes. Thank you so
okay,
much.
let's move on.
Beautifully organised, beautifully delivered with some really, really wonderful emerging messages. So thank you so much for that. Thank you for all that you gave to that session. Thank you. Thank you. Well, here we are. The closing of our first day, and what a day it's been, starting as it did in ceremony outside the Natural History Museum, with much beauty and energy that has carried us through the day. Well done, everyone. Thank you for your intention, your bringing of your good intentions, and thank you for your attention as well. It has been a very long day. And you'll be very happy to hear that I'm not now going to attempt to summarize all the things that I think enough words now. I think it's time for us to move into the evening. Let's sleep on the messages that have emerged and what they mean for us, for our work, for our lives, and for our community. And let's come back with energy tomorrow to build on what we've learned today and to build the connections we're making. So just a couple of things to make you aware of if you didn't know about them. For those with a particular interest to keep going and with a really keen interest on nature-based solutions in the context of the UK, there is a wonderful side event happening very soon, organised by the Wildlife Trusts on evidence into action. Is Zoe here? I think Zoe was going to step up. And Zoe, do you want to step up and say anything about it?
Thank you. It's being held at St Cross College, and it's looking at practical interventions of nature-based solutions in the UK. So it was offered as a ticketed event. Those tickets have sold out, but they are accepting people to go along.
I believe there's space, but the important thing about this is food.
Yeah, there's food and there's some drinks
So,
as
and
well.
given that the largest words in
It
the
goes.
mentees
It
were
fits.
drinks and going
It
for
fits with the
dinner.
Wordle. Yeah, it does.
Exactly.
So sorry, that was slightly flustering my way
It's
through
fine, don't
that.
worry, that's great. So, yeah, St Cross College, which you can put into your phones and it'll magically tell you where to go. The other thing is that for those really wanting to unwind, I encourage you to take a wander in nature in the university park. Something is happening at 6:30. Justin, do you want to say something about this opportunity?
Yeah, what a wonderful day. So we started in ceremony. As a reminder, the fire keepers are holding the fire throughout the 3 days. So the whole conference is in ceremony, and there's an invitation to go and have a walk in university parks, which will kick off at 6:30. The meeting point is if you just turn right out of the gates of the museum and literally walk 2-3 minutes up the road, you get to the entrance of the beautiful park, university parks, and there'll be a gathering there at 6:30 and spending an hour really going into that deeper place and encouraging all of you to feed. I love the summary at the end of panel 3 here of, you know, this is not something we solve just with our heads, but with our hearts, with our souls, with our whole body. And so that chance to really reflect on the day and sit more quietly at the end of the day with a walk that the Astara team will be leading through University Park. So from 6:30 to 7:30, meet by the creperie van at the very entrance to University Parks.
Thank you, Justin. And on that note, I'm going to read a poem now. It's called Testimony by Rebecca Badge. And I want to thank the economist Rebecca Henderson, who drew my attention to this exquisite poem only a few weeks ago. But I thought I wanted to share this with you at the end of this day. In the silence of the wild, I hear the ancient call, a whisper of the earth in the rise and fall. The trees, they speak in tongues, roots deep in sacred ground, a testimony to life in every sight and sound. We are but a thread in nature's vast design, bound to the land and sky by ties we must align. Let us walk with reverence on this path we tread, honor the gift of life in every breath we spread. For in the heart of nature lies the truth we seek, a world where all can flourish in harmony, unique. Good evening.